It was barely a motorcycle. It had 8 cylinders arranged in a V, air-cooled, when almost every machine on 2 wheels in the world had 1 cylinder, or at most 2. The engine had not been designed for a motorcycle at all. It had been built to fly. Someone had taken that engine, an aircraft engine, and bolted it into a long, spindly frame made from bicycle parts, with a leather saddle, thin wire wheels, and almost no brakes worth the name. And on a hard sand beach in Florida in the first month of 1907, that strange, ungovernable thing made a bicycle mechanic from a small town in New York the fastest human being on the face of the earth. He was not a trained engineer. He had no diploma, no laboratory, no company behind him. He was a man who had started out delivering telegrams on a bicycle and who could not stop asking one question: how much power can I get from how little weight? The answer he found on that beach would stand for motorcycles for more than 20 years. And here is the strange part, the part this whole story turns on. Having become the fastest man alive on 2 wheels, he almost immediately walked away from motorcycles forever. Because the record was never really the point. The machine that nearly killed him on the sand was, without his quite knowing it yet, a runway. Every week we tell the stories of the machines and the people who built them. This is the story of Glenn Curtis, of a homemade 8-cylinder engine, and of a man who chased speed along the ground until the ground was no longer enough. The story begins, as so many do, with bicycles. Glenn Hammond Curtis was born in May of 1878 in Hammondsport, a small village on a long, narrow lake in the Finger Lakes country of upstate New York. His schooling was thin, his family was not wealthy, and he went to work young. His first job was as a bicycle messenger for Western Union, carrying telegrams through the streets on 2 wheels. And the bicycle in the 1890s was not a toy. It was the cutting edge of personal machinery. The safety bicycle, with its chain drive and its 2 equal wheels and its pneumatic tires, was barely a decade old, and it had swept the world. It was light, it was efficient, it was fast, and it was the most advanced piece of engineering an ordinary person could own and race and take apart on a workbench. A whole generation of mechanics learned their craft on bicycles, and a striking number of them, on both sides of the Atlantic, would go on to build the first motorcycles, the first cars, and the first aircraft. The bicycle shop was the cradle of the machine age. Curtis took to racing them, and he was good, fast enough to win, competitive enough to hate losing. Then he did what a certain kind of restless mechanical mind always does. He opened his own shop, selling and repairing and eventually building bicycles of his own, under the name Hercules. He was, by his early 20s, a small-town businessman with a talent for machinery and a hunger that a bicycle could not feed, because a bicycle can only go as fast as the legs pushing it. And Curtis had already caught the disease that would run through his entire life, the hunger for more speed than a human body could make on its own. So around the turn of the century, he began bolting small engines onto his bicycle frames. When he could not buy an engine good enough or light enough, he built his own, teaching himself as he went, casting and filing and machining parts by trial and error. There is a story told again and again that his first crude carburetor was fashioned from an empty tomato soup can. Whether that particular detail is true or just a good tale, it captures the man exactly, improvising precision instruments out of whatever was on the shelf. By 1902, he was making motorcycles powered by engines of his own design and his own hands. First singles, then a 2-cylinder V, each one a little more powerful than the last. And from the very beginning, he was chasing one thing above all others, the thing that would define everything he ever built, on the ground and later in the air. Not just power for the weight, the most force he could wring out of the fewest pounds of metal. It is a simple idea, and it is the whole secret of going fast and of flying, so it is worth stopping on for a moment. Any engine can be made more powerful by making it bigger and heavier. That is easy. The hard thing, the valuable thing, is to get more power without more weight. Because in any machine that has to move itself, every extra pound of engine is a pound that the engine then has to carry. On the ground, a heavy engine just means a slower, clumsier vehicle. But in the air, weight is everything. An engine that is too heavy for its power will never leave the ground at all. Curtis understood almost by instinct, long before he ever thought about flying, that the machine that wins is the one with the best ratio of power to weight. He spent his life pushing that ratio, and it would carry him much further than he could have imagined from a bicycle shop in Hammondsport. The speed came quickly. In 1903, on one of his own machines, he set a mile record of 64 miles an hour, a startling figure for a motorcycle of that day. when many automobiles could not match it. The next winter he went south to the long, hard beaches at Homemad, near Daytona in Florida. In those years before purpose-built racetracks, the flat, firm, wave-packed sand of that coast was the great open-air proving ground of American speed, where men brought their cars and their motorcycles to see what they would truly do with a clear run and nothing to hit. There Curtis took a whole series of records at distances from 2 miles up to 10, holding a big twin flat out along the beach for mile after mile. His name began to travel. Serious men who wanted the lightest, strongest engines in the country started making the trip to the small shop in Hammondsport, and Curtis started selling his motors to them. His engines, everyone agreed, gave more power for less weight than almost anything else you could buy. And that reputation for light and powerful engines pulled him toward the one field where light and powerful mattered more than anywhere else on Earth. Not the racetrack, the sky. Because in these same years, at the very start of the 20th century, a handful of dreamers and showmen were trying to get machines into the air. And the thing that defeated almost all of them was the engine. They had wings, they had frames, they had nerve. What they did not have was an engine that made enough power without being too heavy to lift. It was, above all, an engine problem. And there was a young man in upstate New York who thought about almost nothing else. One of those sky dreamers came to him. In 1904, a showman and aeronaut named Thomas Baldwin bought one of Curtis's light V-twin engines and hung it under a long, gas-filled bag, a dirigible airship he called the California Arrow. An airship is not an aeroplane. It floats, held up by a lighter-than-air gas, and it needs an engine only to push it and steer it against the wind. But that is exactly the point. Every airship before it had been at the mercy of the breeze because no one had an engine light enough to drive it and light enough to lift. With that Curtis engine turning its propeller, the California Arrow became the first powered airship in America that a pilot could actually steer and control, flying a course and coming back to where it started. Curtis had, without ever leaving his workbench, put an engine into the sky and made it obey. He was still thinking about the ground, but the sky had taken careful notice of him, and it would come back for him soon. Then came the machine that made his name forever. Curtis had built, with an eye toward aircraft and airships, an engine unlike anything else in his shop. It was an air-cooled V of 8 cylinders, in effect 4 of his motorcycle V-twins, joined together on a single crankshaft. It displaced around 270 cubic inches, close to 4.5 litres, and it produced somewhere near 40 horsepower. An enormous figure for the time, in a package still light enough to fly. It was in truth an aircraft engine looking for an aircraft worthy of it. And Curtis, being Curtis, looked at this thing and had a simple, dangerous thought. He wondered how fast it would go on the ground, so he built a motorcycle around it. And the word motorcycle is being generous. The 8-cylinder engine sat in a long frame, stretched out and reinforced to contain it, far longer than any normal machine. Instead of a chain, the power went to the back wheel through a drive shaft, a spinning steel rod with a universal joint, because a chain of that era simply could not have survived the load. There was a saddle and handlebars and thin tires barely wider than a bicycle's, and for slowing this creature down from any speed at all, there was essentially one weak brake at the rear. Everything about it was wrong for what he was about to do. It had, by any sane standard, no business existing. In January of 1907, at the great speed meet they called the Florida Speed Carnival, Curtis took it down to the sand at Ormond Beach, lay flat along that vast engine, opened it up, and flew along the ground. The figure that comes down to us is 136 miles an hour, on a motorcycle, in 1907. To understand how impossible that number was, hold a few other numbers next to it. Most automobiles of the day could not do half of it. The Wright brothers' aeroplane, 3 years after its first flight, could barely manage 40. And here was a man lying flat along an unbraked machine, driven by a spinning shaft that had never been meant to do anything like this, hurtling down a beach faster than any human being had ever traveled by any means. He covered the measured mile in a little over 26 seconds. And when he finally rolled to a stop, Glenn Curtis was, by common acclaim, the fastest human being on the planet. But here the story has to be honest, because the record itself was a strange half thing, and the truth of it is more interesting than the legend. It was never an official world record in the way we would mean it today. The officials at the meet had already thrown the machine out of every recognized class, because it was simply too powerful, too far beyond anything else there to compete fairly against ordinary motorcycles. The timing was crude, done with handheld stopwatches and men squinting through field glasses at a flag by the finish line. And most tellingly of all, there was only ever one run. To make a speed record official then and now, a rider has to make a return pass in the opposite direction and average the two, so that a following wind or a slope in the ground cannot flatter the figure. Curtis never got his return pass, because on the way back that spinning steel drive shaft, carrying 40 horsepower to the rear wheel at enormous speed, tore itself apart. The universal joint let go, the frame began to buckle and twist, and heavy pieces of whirling machinery flailed around near his feet and legs as he fought the collapsing thing to a halt. He came within inches of being killed by his own record. He survived, walked away, and delivered his verdict on the whole experience in one dry, unforgettable sentence. Riding an 8-cylinder motorcycle, he said, is not likely to become very popular. And he was right, and he knew it. The number would stand for a very long time. As the fastest man on Earth by any means at all, Curtis held the title until 1911, when a monstrous German racing car called the Blitzen-Benz finally went faster, at 141 miles an hour. And purely as a motorcycle record, astonishingly, his mark was not beaten until 1930, 23 years later. But Curtis himself did not wait around to defend it, on the sand or anywhere else. He had felt something on that beach that was bigger than the record. He had felt the limit of the ground. A machine that fast, that violent, that close to killing him, had shown him that 2 wheels and a strip of beach were a dead end. The real frontier, the one place where his particular gift for power and lightness could actually go, was up. That same year, 1907, a letter arrived that pointed him toward it. It came from Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who in his later years had become fascinated, almost obsessed with the problem of human flight. Bell was gathering a small group of young experimenters at his summer estate in Nova Scotia, a group they called the Aerial Experiment Association, and he wanted the best engine man in America to build their motors and help them fly. He wanted Glenn Curtis. And so the bicycle mechanic from Hammond Sports sat down among Bell and a handful of young men, including an Army lieutenant named Thomas Selfridge and a Canadian engineer named John McCurdy, to attack the oldest dream there is. They worked fast, building a series of aircraft one after another, each learning from the last, with names like the Red Wing and the White Wing, the White. And it was here that the group made a quiet decision that would shape the rest of Curtis's life, and nearly all of aviation after him. To control the aircraft as it rolled, to lift one wing and drop the other, they did not twist the whole wing the way the Wright brothers did. Instead, they fitted small hinged flaps at the wingtips, movable surfaces that could be angled up on one side and down on the other. Today we call them ailerons, and every aeroplane in the world now uses them. At the time, it seemed like just another way to solve the same problem. It would turn out to be the spark of a war. On the 4th of July, 1908, Curtis flew the group's newest machine, an aircraft called the June Bug, a distance of over 5,000 feet in front of a crowd of invited witnesses and reporters. It won the Scientific American Trophy and a prize of $2,500, but the money and the cup were the least of it. The June Bug's flight was the first public, pre-announced, officially observed flight of an aeroplane in the United States. And that word public is the heart of it. The Wright brothers had flown first years earlier, in 1903, and there is no taking that away from them. But they had done it in near secret and had spent the years since guarding their invention, flying away from crowds, terrified that someone would steal what they had. Curtis flew in the open on a national holiday, in front of the press and the public, and America watched it happen with its own eyes. In that instant, the bicycle racer became an aviator in the mind of the whole country, and the same instinct that had built the 8-cylinder monster, the relentless chase of power for weight, finally left the ground for good. But the sky exacted its price early, and cruelly. Just 2 months later, in September of 1908, Thomas Selfridge, Curtis's friend and fellow member of the Aerial Experiment Association, went up as a passenger with Orville Wright in one of the Wrights' own aircraft, on a demonstration flight for the Army. A propeller cracked in the air, the machine fell, and Selfridge was killed. He became the first person in history to die in the crash of a powered aeroplane. The dream had its first grave almost before it had properly begun, and everyone in that small world of early flyers, Curtis and the Wrights alike, now knew exactly what they were gambling with. Curtis founded his own company, the Curtis Aeroplane and Motor Company, and within a few short years he was one of the towering figures of world aviation, the great American rival to the Wrights. He turned his mind to a problem no one had solved, getting an aircraft to rise from and land on water. He built floats, then hulls, and created the seaplane and the flying boat, machines that turned every lake and harbour and coastline into a runway. It was Curtiss, more than any other single man, who gave the world naval aviation, aircraft that could operate from the sea, and navies around the world came to him to learn how. When the First World War came, his factories built aircraft and engines by the thousand, and his trainer, the JN-4, universally nicknamed the Jenny, taught a whole generation of American and Allied pilots how to fly. The little shop in Hammondsport had become an empire, and running underneath all of it for years was the war with the Wright brothers, fought not in the air but in the courtroom. The Wrights held a broad and powerful patent covering the way an aircraft controls its roll, and they argued that it covered any method at all of raising one wingtip and lowering the other, including Curtiss's ailerons. In 1909 they sued him. The case, Wright against Curtiss, ground on for years, appeal after appeal, consuming fortunes in legal fees and, worse, freezing American aviation almost solid. Because while the Wrights tried to hold the entire sky under a single patent, and Curtiss fought to prove there was another way to fly, no one could build freely, and American aircraft development fell behind Europe's just as the world was sliding toward war. It was not truly ended until 1917, when the United States, needing warplanes urgently and desperately, forced the manufacturers to pool their patents so that aircraft could actually be built. Curtiss spent the strongest years of his life as the outsider who would not be shut out of the air, and in the end the sky was too big for any one patent to hold. In 1919 the point was made for all time. A Curtiss flying boat, the NC-4, became the first aircraft in history to cross the Atlantic Ocean, hopping the sea by way of Newfoundland and the Azores to Portugal, years before Lindbergh would do it alone and non-stop. The boy from the bicycle shop had helped conquer the ocean by air. The last act of his life has a quiet irony to it. Having made his fortune and changed the world, Curtiss grew tired of the cold winters and the endless litigation of the North, and he moved to Florida, to the same warm coast whose beaches had made him famous. And there, of all things, he became a developer of land, laying out and building whole new towns in the flat country near Miami, towns that still stand today. The man who had chased speed across the world spent his final years measuring out quiet streets in the sun. He died in 1930 in Buffalo, New York, at just 52 years old, of a blood clot that formed after an emergency operation to remove his appendix gone far too soon. And in that very same year, his old motorcycle record on the sand, that unofficial, one-way, nearly fatal run from 1907, was at last beaten by another rider on another machine. The two great threads of his life, the ground and the air, reached their end almost together. A few years earlier, in a final twist he did not live to see completed, his company and the Wright Company, the two bitter rivals, were merged into a single firm. To this day it still bears both their names, joined at last. Curtiss Wright. The 8-cylinder motorcycle, the machine that started all of it, was not scrapped or lost. It survives, and it sits today not in a motorcycle museum but in the Smithsonian's Great National Collection of Aircraft in Washington, which is exactly where it belongs, because that machine was never really about the motorcycle at all. Its engine had been born to fly, and the man who lay along it on the sand was already, though he did not yet have the words for it, reaching upward. He chased speed along the ground until the ground itself ran out, and then he simply kept going into the air. The fastest man on Earth turned out to be a man who was only ever passing through on his way to the sky. If stories like this are why you are here, the ones about the people behind the machines, and not only the machines themselves, consider subscribing, and we will keep telling them. Next time we stay with that strange bond between motorcycles and the sky. We follow a motorcycle with an eagle spread across its tank, built by men who had been flyers in the war. That eagle is not a badge, and it is not decoration. It is a grave marker placed there for a young pilot who died before the company that would carry his memory was ever born.